Okay, and we are live once again this Thursday evening, Pacific Standard Time, with your council member, the People's Council member, moi, Carroll Fife. And tonight we're going to talk about a very serious issue that is on the minds of all Oaklanders, as well as people around the country, and that is the issue of public safety and the role of policing in that conversation. In the city of Oakland, we've been discussing and budgeting for what it looks like to reimagine public safety. And it's important that in that conversation, we look at the history of what policing has been in this country, as well as the direction for which it's going in the future. And so tonight, I wanted to just have a really candid conversation. And I thought it would be important to bring special voices who've been working on this subject around the country. And we have a very special guest, Norm Stamper. He is the previous police chief for the Seattle Police Department. He's going to talk a little bit more about what he's done. But I think it's important to, especially in Oakland, where we're seeing law enforcement take a bigger position around public safety and even taking the position of being activists, have a different look from the inside out of what it means to reimagine public safety. And with this individual that we have on tonight, he's gotten death threats for reimagining public safety or having a perspective about what that looks like. It's a heavy shift. It's one that many residents of our city are not willing to have a discussion about. They want to stick with some of the ways that things have been done traditionally. But as we've seen with the George Floyd uprisings, and the verdict, honestly, there's been a different perspective around what should be happening in this conversation, in our actions, in our budgeting, in everything that we do around policing in this country. And we want to keep that conversation going because at the core of what we're trying to do, it is really keeping our people safe. And we've got to expand the definition of what it means to be safe in America, because I would argue that it's more than just your physical property. It's more than just what you own, but it's also access to affordable housing, healthcare, public education, all of the social safety net things that are so critical to people actually living lives where they can thrive. You've heard me say that a million times. So I do want to say for the record, my perspectives are my own. Norm's are his own, and our additional guests will be their own. So I'm not saying that we're going to agree on everything, but I think it's critical that we have these conversations. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome our guest tonight. That is Norm Stamper. Thank you for being with us this evening. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you, Council Member, for having me on and talking with you and your listeners, your observers. I'm delighted to be here. I thoroughly enjoyed our last conversation. Looking forward to this one.
Outstanding. Well, let's just jump right into it. I gave a very brief and shallow description of who you are. Can you just share a little bit about your history and tell us kind of your background in law enforcement and what you're doing now?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. I was a police officer for 34 years, the first 28 in San Diego, and the last 6 from 94 to 2000 as, pardon me, Seattle's police chief. After a rookie year of abusing the citizens, I was hired to protect and serve, something I swore to myself I would never do, but did do as a result of the enormous power of the police culture. And it just sucked me into its clutches, and I was in short order saying and doing things I'd never said or done before. And thank God I ran afoul of a principled prosecutor who asked me if the Constitution of the United States meant anything to me. I had taken to him an arrest. We were talking about it in the hallway of the courthouse. And I was thinking, wait a minute, this guy's supposed to be on my side. And he challenged me, and I will forever be indebted to him for having done that at my ripe age of 21 or 22. So I did spend my entire adult life either in police work or for the last 20 years, looking at police work, studying it. I have a PhD in leadership and human behavior, having done my dissertation on the professed values versus the observed behavior of America's big city police chiefs. Once I had my comeuppance at the hands of that prosecutor, that principled prosecutor, I have conceived of myself and have spent my life being a change agent within the institution. There have been moments when I've slipped. There have been moments that have been less than easy, I can assure you, and many, many moments when I have earned the enmity of my fellow officers. But I'm proud to say that it hasn't stopped me, that what's desperately needed is truly profound, sweeping institutional change. There are 18,000 police departments in this country. San Diego's one, Seattle's one, Oakland's another. But of those 18,000 police departments, many are systematically violating their fellow Americans' constitutional rights. They are here to help engender safety and respect for law, and too often they're doing the opposite. The result of which is that very few people, I think, in our society feel safe. The police have historically been aligned with moneyed and property classes. They have historically been aligned with, let's say, landlords over tenants, merchants over consumers, management over labor, which is ironic given the fact that most cops belong to a labor organization. I could go on forever. I promise you I won't. I'm very, very interested in your questions. I believe it's time for a sea change. And I believe the George Floyd murder on May 20th of last year and the aftermath of that murder tragically gives cause for hope. I have never seen a country more willing to challenge itself and some basic assumptions about what public safety looks like, what policing looks like. And I'm pleased to say that at least a few of those voices are coming from within the ranks. Not enough yet, but I think as soon as more police officers listen, genuinely listen to the people in their communities, and particularly young people, poor people, and people of color, they'll also come around. But it is going to require inspired and gutsy leadership by elected officials such as yourself, and from within the ranks, officers willing to stand up to their fellow cops.
You said a lot.
I did.
No, and not just in words, but in ideology, in theory, and some of it I'm struggling with, because I don't know if an institution that you just listed often puts property over people, management over labor. What are some of the things you said? Money and property, that has focused on the moneyed and property class, landlords over tenants. How do you take a system like that is much bigger than the individuals that comprise that system,
Sure,
and do anything to change it?
well, it does come down, I believe, to winning hearts and minds. And one of the things that I know about myself is that even when it's really, really hard to do, if I purposely, I saw you taking some deep breaths before we began this evening. I do exactly the same thing. And for me, that's an opportunity to ground myself, center myself, and ask what I'm willing to say to you tonight, what we are willing to say to one another about the role of women in American law enforcement, about the role of people of color in American law enforcement, and about what public safety might look like if those who are engaged in that service have taken deep into their hearts the principles of the Constitution of this country. You don't stop someone for no reason. You don't stop someone or arrest someone or cite someone because of the color of their skin. You don't treat kids badly. You basically embrace this notion that we are all in this together. And that can either come across as a pie in the sky, kumbaya kind of a moment or philosophy, or it can come across a lot more practical. It's like, are we teaching, and I mean truly teaching the Constitution to recruit police officers? Are we teaching definitions of community and society and what it means to live in a pluralistic, multicultural country? And I think it's also vital that we teach leadership of the brand that you practice, if I may court favor with you and just tell you that I'm blown away by your style of leadership. What is it that we can teach police officers about leadership that says it's not about making loud noises? It's not about screaming and hollering. There's a time and a place for that. It's about listening. It's about really hearing that 17-year-old kid on the street corner. Why is that young person angry at you? Well, the top of my list, based on what I've heard from so many of them, is because they're scared of you. They've seen what you've done. They've seen you commit murder in front of an entire nation. They have seen abuses of police authority. Well, what if we were to just go to work on re-engineering the entire institution, recognizing that it is born of the days of slavery in this country? Police officers throughout the South were part of the slave catcher institution, the mechanism of capturing slaves who had walked off or run off the plantations and bringing them back to their owners and collecting a bounty. That's where American policing originates, really. And so if we want police officers to treat people today with dignity and respect, and to listen to them and partner with them to solve crimes and achieve public safety at the neighborhood level, and for that matter, in people's homes, domestic violence being a huge problem in our society, well, then let's start talking about our origins and why so many people over a backyard fence or at a dinner table will never find them saying, I remember the days when I knew this beat cop on a street corner, knowledgeable, informed, sensitive, respectful. What a great contribution to our community he was. How many Black people or other people of color say that in this country over the dinner table, or have said anything like that for generations? If we want it turned around, it's got to be all of us, and especially police officers working on that challenge.
And I think what I'm hearing is there's a responsibility of the individuals. There's a responsibility for training. There's a responsibility to support a different type of leadership. And I would ask, like, I believe that starts early. I believe that starts with education before people are even recruited or think about becoming law enforcement officers. But our schools are highly segregated because resources follow tax bases, right? And
Sure.
because there's also been a deep segregation in housing and employment. What you tend to see is concentrated poverty in certain areas. And that's very true for areas of East Oakland and West Oakland. And I know you're somewhat familiar with the city.
Yes.
And so that also means that you have individuals who might have never grown up with or have relationships with people who are not like them.
Right.
And I specifically mean white officers who are coming in from other areas that surround the city and have deep-seated racial animus. So what happens? How do you even get to a point where people see other folks as human beings to want to respect them in the first place? How do you train someone out of racism and bigotry and bias?
By learning everything we can about adult learning. I agree with you completely that this learning has to start at a very early age. But let's make the practical assumption that people currently taking police jobs are not a product of that kind of education that I'm assuming we agree is necessary. So how do we reimagine the selection process? Well, we need people from the community participating fully in the selection process, sitting shoulder to shoulder with police commanders, for example, and at the hiring decision, at the time that the actual hiring decision is made. We need citizen participation in every aspect of policymaking, program development, crisis management, and we certainly need people from the community shaping in partnership with so-called experts the curriculum, shaping the methods of instruction and the methods of testing to satisfy ourselves that, yeah, these new cops, they're getting the message. They understand that they are becoming a part of a people's police, that they are not part of an occupational force, that that so much of what we have seen on television in the response to the George Floyd protests is, to put it kindly, misguided. And so much of it has been so damaging to the very fragile, incremental, tiny improvements that we've been trying to make in law enforcement. So I would say it starts with understanding that what we've been doing isn't working. Put it bluntly, it's wrong. We need to do that which is right. And that means very, very different shifts in who we hire, how we train them, how we supervise them, how we discipline them. And one thing we really, really must do, and that is to say to new cops and current cops, this city, this police department is different, very different from the way it was 5 years, 10 years, 15 or 20 years ago. Frankly, it's different from the way it was yesterday. We are committed to a new course we are committed, in your language, to reimagining public safety and policing. It's not going to be we're the cops and you're not. We're the cops and we know what to do. It's going to be we are all in this together. And the partnership simply cannot be reduced to cops and the people who love them. It's got to be police officers and those who are very, in some cases, very, very critical of police policies and practices. So if we forge that partnership, I'm convinced, as I'm fond of saying, it's not going to happen till, it's not going to happen Tuesday of next week. This is very, very arduous work that we are talking about. All we need is a critical mass. We don't need everybody to say, yeah, that's a good new direction for American law enforcement. But it's going to take enough to hit that tipping point and to create the change I think that we all want.
I guess my position is a little more cynical. I mean, we all want that. And that is one of the things that I'm working towards. And I guess I'm cynical because we're all familiar with the term that crime pays, right? Everyone's heard that.
Sure.
But I feel like it pays the people who are engaged in lower level crimes the least. And what I mean when I say that is that mass incarceration is big business. It's big business with the criminal justice system, with mass incarceration, the prison industrial complex. And you mentioned that the roots of modern day policing were based in slave patrols, which was to return enslaved Africans back to their plantations to do unpaid labor. And that very same thing is happening in our prisons today, where you have millions of individuals that are engaged in doing that same type of unpaid labor, or very, very low wage, cents an hour, to engage in work that's benefiting someone. It's benefiting the private prisons that they work for, and oftentimes the public prisons.
Yeah.
So what is the incentive to stop that chain of people going into that system? It seems like it actually is beneficial to have a certain level of crime to keep those institutions moving and to continue that unpaid labor force that is our prison industrial complex. How do you address that?
You know, as you're describing that, I'm thinking, well, of course, that's exactly, I mean, that's accurate and it's comprehensive. I mean, that is the picture of the other end of the criminal justice system. The cops are the gatekeepers. They're the ones that are on the streets of our neighborhoods and our communities. They're the ones that are scooping up people, some of whom are certifiably dangerous and really do not belong on the streets, do not belong in the schools, do not belong in homes or in workplaces, because they have demonstrated their danger to community. That's a very, very tiny percent of our population, yet we build a whole system around those folks. We'll always need to make sure, in the interest of public safety, that armed and dangerous people who would just as soon shoot somebody or take a hostage and engage in violent criminal behavior. I mentioned domestic violence earlier. Frankly, that's where everyone, I believe, who is violent gets his or her first lesson. It's in the American home. That's tragic. I mean, that's tragic. Are you learning to settle disputes or disagreements between one another within the family with a fist or a gun or a foot? I mean, it's important, I think, to recognize the systemic implications of everything that you're talking about, so that we understand that we can. Now I'll go back to something you said a moment ago about cynicism. I get asked all the time, well, why are you so enthusiastic about this reform? And I am. Well, I don't much care for the alternative. I don't much care for cashing in my chips and walking away. I believe in what I'm talking about. I certainly would like to practice what I profess, but cynicism is insidious.
Yeah.
I forget who it was now. It was a cynic is one who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. So don't listen to cynics as they spout off about why this won't work and why that won't work. You know, the elected officials won't do this, the cops won't do that, the this, the that, so on and so forth. Well, if you embrace this notion that change is doable, if you embrace the notion that it can be guided, that it can be influenced, that it can be led, and it's not going to be led, I'm convinced, by people who don't listen. It's got to be led by people who are every day in every way listening, because if nothing else, they're educating themselves and becoming more powerful as leaders. But just because Cop A wants to do it this way and Cop B wants to do it that way, and both of those ways are legal, and let's say moral and ethical. I once heard Thomas Merton, not the philosopher, but a penologist in the Cummins and Tucker prison farms in Arkansas, say, you know, if the governor wants the barns painted green and you're a traditionalist and you want them painted red, maybe you should just give up on red. Maybe you should go with what this powerful elected official has a preference for, because that's not substantive. That's cosmetic. That's image, and it could be important in certain respects. But the bottom line is, if you want to work with people who see the world differently from the way we do, then it's important, especially important, to listen to them. But I was driving at one point that I allowed myself to talk myself out of for a second, and I want to return to it. And that is, there is no substitute for firing each and every police officer who violates constitutional standards, who violates stop and frisk, search and seizure, rules of arrest, and God knows, use of force. Those are procedural justice principles that are embedded in our Constitution. And in every single state, we have laws that bar excessive force. And if the message is, if you can't or won't play by the rules, you're out of here. You know, see if Kmart's hiring, see if Walmart's hiring, but give us back that badge. We made a mistake giving it to you, and it's time to say goodbye. And there's no substitute for very strong and very principled leadership. It's got to start at the executive level, I'm convinced, to say these walls have heard for the last time a racial or an ethnic or a misogynist or a homophobic slur. Those days are gone. We don't talk that way. We don't think that way. We don't feel that way. We certainly don't act that way. Now, if you happen to be a holdover to an earlier form of policing, which pretty much represents where we are today, then it's time to start looking for a new job, because you cannot be a police officer. You cannot hold this very delicate position, engaged in enormously sensitive, life-impacting decisions on your fellow officers, yourself, as well as the community. Then get out.
Well, there's that. So thank you for sharing that, Norm. I want to say once again to the people who are listening at home, and the people who are watching online on Twitter, on YouTube, thank you once again for joining us. We're here with Norm Stamper, former Seattle, Washington police chief and reformist. I don't know, Norm, how would we describe you today, Norm? How would we describe the work that you do?
Well, we go back to a San Diego Union Tribune headline when I was a lieutenant: new breed advocate of radical change. So I've been at
new breed advocate of radical change.
Yeah, that's kind of romanticizes it, but I don't reject it. I think it's apt. I think it's accurate. Let me add one more credential to my portfolio. I'm a very proud member of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, and I know your next guest is also a prominent member of that organization.
That's a great segue. That's a great segue to bring in our next guest, who I'm going to ask to describe what that organization is. So if we can bring on Carl, that would be awesome. So Carl, why don't you tell us a little bit about the organization that Norm just mentioned today, and who you are and what you do?
I don't appreciate Norm kissing that off to me. That's actually, he's the senior member and he's responsible for that. A couple of caveats. I'm having a streaming problem, so I might be in and out. And also, my background is not as nice as Norm's. You're looking at my dirty bedroom, so just an apology there. So Law Enforcement Action Partnership, when I joined the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, we were actually law enforcement against prohibition. This is going back several years. And our primary platform then was the legalization of drugs and the realization and acknowledgement that the war on drugs is an abject failure. However, as time has gone on over the last 6 or 7 years, and we've seen just so many glaring problems with law enforcement nationwide, we realized that there was a bigger issue here than besides the war on drug. That's a very big issue that talks to a lot of the racial disparities and discriminations. The like you said, Councilwoman, the prison industrial complex. But we morphed into Law Enforcement Action Partnership, where we cover the gamut of everything. Like a lot of the questions that you brought up about how do we correct this situation. Right now, one of the big issues that we're dealing with, that I'm speaking a lot about, and the reason I'm here tonight, alternative community responders, alternative solutions to what the tried and true traditional law enforcement model is. So that's basically a law enforcement action partnership is an international nonprofit organization comprised of individuals like Norm and myself, either that were directly in law enforcement, a lot of judicial officers, judges, probation officers, anybody, parole agents, prison guards, people that either saw the futility of what they were doing or the problems within the system while they were doing it, or upon retirement could reflect back and realize that what they were doing was part of a broken system. So we've all coalesced into this organization who is trying, and I'm very impressed with the leadership here because we're making a lot of inroads with different programs, the community responder program being the big one. So that's Law Enforcement Action Partnership in a nutshell.
That's really helpful. And I'm going to circle back with you as the chair of the City of Oakland's Public Safety Committee. I'm looking for ways, and I have to share just a brief caveat that no one was terribly eager to take that position as the chair of that committee. Perhaps because of the time that we're living in, there are a lot of uprisings and a lot of demands for not just radical change, but there's a spectrum of change that people are demanding right now. I think not just in Oakland, but across the country that range from reform to abolition. And so my task as the chair of public safety is, especially as one who does not have a lot of trust in this system, is a challenging one. It's a heavy one. But I think, Norm, you said something that is really important to me, which is to listen, which is what I'm attempting to do right now, because I think everyone should share their perspective towards a safer reality. But I've got to say, I struggle with cynicism. I don't live there. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting in this seat. But it is something that is challenging for me in this role, in this new role of being an elected official. So I'm working to listen, but it is so hard, especially when you're working with an institution that is led by people who are lying. It's hard. There's this whole narrative that's happening in Oakland right now saying that the police department was defunded when our budget is $30+ million more for the police department than it was in the previous cycle. And then are using community tactics to further division between the public and the police. So I don't even know how you begin to build a relationship asking for people to work with you if you're consistently spreading untruths. Like, where do you even, and maybe that's not a question for you all, but maybe it's a question that maybe we need mediation or restorative justice with a law enforcement action partnership. I'm not sure, but that's one of the reasons I said I'm going to circle back, because where do you go when people are not willing, when the people who are supposed to protect and serve have a hard time even telling the truth?
I was talking to Tanya before we started this session, and it's interesting. Well, first of all, I'll say you said you're willing to listen, and obviously you got two old white guys on here waxing poetic about their histories. But my background, unlike Norm and a lot of people out there that are administrators, I spent my career on the street. I was a San Francisco police officer for 32 years. I promoted to the rank of sergeant, and that was it, because that was what I love doing. I also was born and raised in San Francisco, which touches on what you were talking about. These officers, an Oakland police officer who grew up in San Ramon and goes to a police academy and is suddenly in, your council district and has never dealt with any culture outside of San Ramon. It's a big ask to expect that person to take 40 hours of cultural sensitivity training and suddenly become very empathetic to what the situation is there. But my career, I spent the bulk of my career as a street cop, which I take a lot of pride in saying, primarily walking different beats, the Tenderloin District and North Beach. But I also spent 3 years in narcotics in the 80s, the mid 80s. So I don't think I need to say anything more about that, except as a member of the war, a foot soldier in the war on drugs, we were sent primarily to the Baby Hunters Point or the Western Addition, communities of color, or the Tenderloin, which is a community of, of people that are either on welfare or public assistance. But I had the good fortune to be able to engage with people and to be able to talk to them and to really get a feel for what was going on in my community. And even though I've retired, moved to Sebastopol, I still, that's my city. It's where, like Tony Bennett said, I left my heart. But what we're dealing with and what we're talking about now, the community responder program, when I was working, not only did I have all these different assignments, I was actually an active member of the police association, the vaunted police unions, which are protecting the officers. And I did my fair share of defending cops, not necessarily bad cops, but cops who were in trouble. But I also worked and interacted a lot with the Civilian Oversight Board. And what Norm said about, officers getting fired, it's beautiful to have a system that has everybody's entitled to due process. But the police, as we've seen, when we get into areas in California, it's the 3300 of the government code, which protects officers. And now the big issue is qualified immunity, which is a whole different subject for a whole different time. Mm-hmm. But I think what I'm hearing from you, Councilwoman Fife, is the fact that, I share your cynicism, and I share your cynicism to the point that, and this is a very much of an aside, I'm getting ready to run for sheriff in Sonoma County because I've gotten so frustrated and so dejected with what I see, the abuses, the training, and it goes to all of the issues and all the subjects we talk about. The hiring, number one, the training, which I don't even like the word training. I think we need to teach officers more, not perishable skills, but I did a couple of years of law school. I didn't finish, but in law school, like in grad school, even undergrad, they treat you like an adult. And yet we have this paramilitary system where we hire these kids, 21 years old, minimum requirement is a high school diploma. Mm-hmm. And then we put them through this sort of police robot factory is what I call it. And then we throw them out on the street, again, with little blocks of training and all this different subject matter. I made a presentation to Half Moon Bay City Council recently, and one of the council members used the analogy of a doctor, and which I thought was being very generous. But comparing the police officers to sort of general practitioners, they know a lot about a little bit about a lot of things, but when it comes to needing a specialist, that they can't handle it. And in my career, I will give that over I started in 1981 and I retired in 2013. And the police officers are being asked and tasked with doing stuff that's way beyond the scope of what they're capable of doing, not what they're trained to do. They just are not capable of dealing with these intractable mental health issues, these quality of life issues that we talk about. And it's a big ask. The difficulty that you're referring to, Councilwoman, is that the police are very insular, and there's also a lot of inertia where they almost feel it's a personal slight when you say, look, we're going to send a social worker out to handle this, or we're going to send a mental health care professional, or we're going to send somebody who deals with addiction issues to deal with the situation. And the response generally, and because I was a foot soldier and because I worked amongst the troops, I know the mindset. And the mindset is, they throw their hands up like their hair's on fire, and you're going to send a social worker in, it's going to be really bad. Mm-hmm. The anecdote that I share, and the reason I get called in for my credibility, is in 32 years as a police officer, just handling an endless volume of calls, seeing officers getting hurt, and my own partner got killed, I still walk away going, it's not that dangerous. It's not that bad out there. There are isolated incidents, but I read the it's at the Anti-Police Terrorism Project, the assessment of the phone calls, 911 calls, and those numbers are pretty true across the board nationwide. We've already determined through LEAP in a joint venture that we did, the Community for American Progress, the Center for American Progress, 40% of all 911 calls are dealing with somebody in some form of a mental health crisis. And then you can go to another additional, and roughly 25 to 40 then you go beyond that to approximately 60% of all 911 calls have to deal with, again, quality of life, either mental health, drug or alcohol related, or are crimes that are cold, basically old burglaries or thefts with no suspect, to where we want the police officers, you want the best police officer, the most well-equipped officer to deal with that specific crime, but not quality of life issues. And that's where I think we need to move forward. But like you refer to, is how do we break it loose? And I know that, if the police brass has been involved in some of these reimagining that Oakland is doing, they're the more learned individuals like Norm, they've got the master's degrees and they have buy-in. It's the rank and file that's really, it's always going to be difficult to break that mold. And I think what we're hearing nationwide is, you hear this again, a lot of scare tactics is, well, nobody's signing up to be a police officer now because they're afraid of the consequences. Oh, qualified immunity. If we lose qualified immunity, we're going to lose police officers. And my response is, maybe we don't want those people to be police officers. Maybe we need to hit a reset on the system. And like Norm alluded to, I want to hire deputies and police officers that have a 2-year degree, that have a sociology background, that have a psychology background, not somebody that's got 80 hours of, defensive weapon tactics. And it's looking at the whole system and trying to, it's going to be grassroots, but we're here talking about this now. Your election, from what I understand, you beat the incumbent and you had a real big support network that got you elected. Now, unfortunately, the bar is really high for you because you've got a high standard to live up to. But again, that's why we're here now. And this is how the change is going to happen. It's going to happen with all of us coming together, all races, creeds, cultures, socioeconomic backgrounds, to get this done. Because again, George Floyd was the straw that broke the camel's back. But Norm and I know better than you, based on our life experiences. It goes back to the Watts riots of the 60s and just keeps going on and on and on. So we have to do something. And if it's just, like I use the term, baby steps, these are baby steps that we're taking. But what you're trying to do in Oakland, what they're doing in Berkeley, what's been done in Eugene, Oregon, these communities that have reimagined law enforcement, that are sending in community responders, alternative responders, that's the wave of the future. That's basically the Tesla of cars. We're leaving internal combustion cars behind and going to the electric model. And God love you for doing this and having us here.
Ooh, listen, I have so many thoughts right now, but instead of me talking more, you all have shared a lot. Are you open to taking some questions that we're hearing from the chat, or just comments?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course.
So I see it. I think it's Blair Beekman, B. Beekman, and it just says, Blair, you're going to have to help us with that. I'm not sure what it means by peer review programs. Are you at? I'm from peer review ideas, but people may feel uncomfortable with its beginnings. Was that mentioned by either you, Carl, or Norm? Peer review ideas?
No.
Exactly.
I didn't mention it either, but I'm happy to respond to it if we get some clarity.
Yeah, Mr. Beekman, if you could add, Mr. Beekman is a pretty regular participant in city council meetings, has a lot of good information to share. Right. Mr. Beekman, if you could just clarify a little bit more what you mean, just drop that in the chat and we'll answer it. But from Catherine, we have a question for the guests. Can you shed light on how the police manipulate local politics so powerfully and avoid any form of reform or accountability? How is it possible that at the Rodney King trial, the police chief can refuse accountability and threaten LA council members? Well, I'm not sure. That's a question about a former case. I'm sure there's lots of other examples, but how is it that the police can avoid accountability is just a general question.
The bottom line for me is that the people let him avoid accountability. It could be the elected officials and anybody and everybody who simply nodded when Daryl Gates said what he had to say in the wake of the Rodney King horrific beating. Is is colluding with him and allowing him to escape accountability. I debated Daryl Gates in Seattle, as a matter of fact, probably 2 years before I left the city. So it would have been the late 90s. Now, it was the early 90s that this country was rocked by the Rodney King incident and the Simi Valley trials, and then the uprisings in throughout the city and in other parts of the country as well. And I think it was one of those classic learning moments from which we learned little. I was asked by the state, Carl can appreciate this, our post-program Commission on Police Officers Standards and Training asked me to moderate a 3-day symposium for police chiefs from throughout the state. And the fundamental question was, why did those cops who looked on and saw a fellow officer beat a fellow human being to within inches of his life do that? Why did they not intervene? And they were coining phrases like bystandership. Well, the bottom line is there were police officers sworn to uphold the law who witnessed what everyone in the country witnessed and did nothing. And the same can be said some 20 plus years later or certainly, 20 plus years later in the Derek Chauvin Minneapolis beating. So there's just something about people acting as if they're in charge. Well, question them, challenge them, be a real American and ask them if the Constitution means anything to them. And I think when it comes to, peer review, to accountability of police chiefs and others, we've all got to hold one another accountable. That means raising questions and making statements.
I've got to piggyback on that, Norm, because that's something that has recently come up with our own local police chief that said, based on the city council's 6-2 vote to invest $18 million, 17.4 to be exact, into preventive services, that the city council needed to be held accountable. So accountability is a word that's used by all sides. So how do we hold each other accountable? Because I'll share my council colleagues, the majority of them wanted to do something different. Right now, we invest a lot into punishment versus prevention. And so it is our perspective that at some point we've got to start investing in these communities who have been underinvested in and under-resourced to stop this type of, especially property crime and theft. We've got to start investing in programs to give people a shot at life. And if we don't, then we're only going to give ultimately 100% of our budget to law enforcement, because no one will have any resources in the community to actually want to live, right? And in our communities that, have a lot of illegal dumping, a lot of, sex trafficking, all of these things, a lot of the crime that is engaged in, the crime is people trying to survive.
Yeah.
So how do we have this question of accountability when it's being used by both sides?
Carl?
It's a tough one, and part of it is, and getting back to the original question, is about the how the police hold sway over the politicians. This goes to, it's an interesting analogy, but the reality is that the police officers in any given city, like even in Oakland, they operate sort of out of a sense of fear, and then when you introduce the police unions into it, most politicians want that endorsement, or they want the money from the police association. Mm-hmm. And so that's how they end up holding a lot of sway with the politicians. And then they kind of dig in. The police mindset is that if we don't get what we want, we won't do what we're told or asked. And we saw that in New York.
What?
That we're seeing some of that, almost like they call it the blue flu. And I don't know that this is But in New York, there's actual factual evidence that the police officers there were so disillusioned with de Blasio and the end of stop and frisk that they did kind of a slowdown, and they weren't responding to serious crimes and calls for service. So it's the amount of political sway, the disproportional amount of political sway that the administrations and more than that, the police associations hold. And that's why a lot of the politicians are afraid to sort of buck that system.
So we have another question. How can the police unions be less powerful? And I just, to add to that, the blue flu that you just described, I think that there was another big case in Detroit, Michigan, where there was a reduction in the police budget. And that happened just as you said. They stopped showing up to calls for service, and especially some serious calls for service, in order to protest this budget reduction. So how do you stop that type of power and influence that really impacts people's lives?
The short answer is exactly what you're doing, and that's we have to vote. We have to get politicians in there that are willing to stand up to the unions, because the unions, the associations, however you want to call them, they have to negotiate with the city or the respective municipality or the county that they're in, and as long as they get what they want, as long as they get their full budget, there's no reason for them to play nice. There's no reason for them to be more cooperative or considerate as to what's going on. And until we take away or reduce some of the safeguards that the police unions protect the officers with, the only way we're going to do it is by voting and getting people into office, mayors, council people, supervisors that aren't beholden to the police associations, and push back, or at least hold the ground. And hopefully eventually the police unions will realize that they have to be more cooperative and community minded.
But Carl, that's dangerous. That's dangerous if services are being withheld. That's literally like playing with people's lives. And so it's a tough situation as an elected official to be in, when you know that's a tactic that could be used. It's like an unofficial strike.
Right.
And so I'm going to sit with that a little while. There were a couple more questions that came through. So if we could get those questions back on this. So Mr. Beekman has his question back up. After the events of George Floyd, police peer review programs came down from the state level and was often talked about in local city councils as a goof starting point.
I think he means good starting point.
Oh,
that's a typo.
Thank you for catching
that. That's what I thought he was referring to. So in a lot of the police reform talk, you hear about them. It's I don't know the actual term, but it's like mandatory reporting. So if 2 cops or 3 cops are there and they see some cop misbehave or do something wrong, there's a compulsion, there's a mandatory requirement. Like George Floyd's a good example. Those 3 officers that stood by while Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd, they would have been required to report. So it's sort of a peer pressure type thing. And I think that's how his question started off. It's not a bad idea, but like a lot of these things, I really feel, again, it's another Band-Aid. The bottom line, what we want is, we don't want officers doing that to begin with. We don't want officers misbehaving, but to have a mandatory requirement. And in San Francisco, when I got promoted, it's a very progressive police department, and the emphasis on monitoring and reporting any misconduct by any of your employees is pretty firmly taught to the new sergeants, and it's followed relatively closely. So I think that's what Mr. Beekman's asking, and it is a good idea. It's a good starting point, as he points out, or a goof starting point.
Oh my goodness. I'm glad you caught that typo. Okay, here's another question from Becca Scharf. It's concerning that a police academy can require only 40 hours of cultural sensitivity training. What does that training involve?
It's usually cast as cultural competence. Some will use terms like human relations training, communication skills training. The basic premise is, how do we get along with, how do we communicate with people who are different from us? who look different from us, who have different values and beliefs and opinions and expectations? How do you create appreciation for cultural diversity as opposed to judging it in the ways that too often in this country result in the isms, in racism, in sexism, and the like? So it's a wonderful step in the right direction. My quarrel is not with the intention. It's not with it's not even with the curriculum so much as how it's presented. What's the instructional strategy? We're dealing with grown-ups. Now, some of us, myself included, are not all that grown up at 21 years of age. There's a lot of immaturity. Everything we know about brain science tells us that brain isn't really developed until age 25 or later. So we're dealing with people who are starting with a developmental challenge in terms of their thinking and their reasoning and so on and so forth. Add to that the white cop who grows up in a lily white community and then is assigned, as the two of you are both talking about, to a black community. What's that going to look like? How successful is that officer going to be? So I would come back to the instructional strategy. In San Diego, for a good long time, we took officers out of the academy, had them show up to community-based organizations, CBOs, throughout the city, but particularly in economically disadvantaged neighborhoods, in communities of color, and we assigned them, for example, to a community service agency that helped people who walking in traffic, who are coming in and saying, I don't know how to do my taxes. I don't know what my obligation is. Practical things that were troubling them. And we had officers sitting there. You know, we questioned this: do we really want cops helping people with their taxes? No, but we want police officers serving as a bridge to get them the help that they need. And that's exactly what these cops did. They were there for 2 full weeks at the height of the program, came back and were just agog. They had learned so much from talking to and mostly listening to people at the grassroots level in communities across the city. So I think it's important that we expand, and typically 40 hours seems to be the default set of hours for cultural diversity. But if you're really trying to get at social equity and racial justice and sensitivity and empathy on the part of police officers and dealing with people who are different from them, give them an opportunity to practice it in the academy, and yet in the real world. It was a very good program.
Thank you for sharing that. And you mentioned something that is a big topic in the city of Oakland, which is the academy. And with our academies, they will range between $3.6 to $3.8 million per academy, which will yield on average 17 officers. What can we do to address that huge, really cash burn, and get a better outcome for our city?
Clay, do you want to respond to that? I've got one, but I've been mouthing off here quite a while.
And so have I. I think we talk about civilian oversight of police departments when it comes to complaints of misconduct, but I think that the department would be served well to have some sort of a civilian monitor the classes, to be there to see how the instruction. California Peace Officer Standard Training regulates every law enforcement agency in the state, and they're also the ones that come up with the minimum training standards and the minimum training criteria. I'm going to share a little anecdote with you. I went through the police academy in San Francisco in 1981. 3 years ago, I was thinking about going back into law enforcement at sort of a ground level, an ad hoc part-time employee. So I took some classes over at Napa Valley Community College, which is actually a place that trained some of the BART officers that were involved with the Fruitvale Station. And as a 60-something-year-old adult retired police sergeant sitting in a classroom and listening to some of these instructors, I will stop short of I was appalled. I was absolutely appalled, because it was worse than it was in 1981. You get guys like Norm and me, but without the passion for reform, that are up there telling war stories and are just, and it's all they reinforce at that very early stage the us versus them mentality. So until we can change that system, and that's why I talk about hiring more well-rounded, more worldly type individuals. But the long answer that I'm giving, the short answer is to have somebody from city government sit in there, monitor, see what the training is like, and then start to insist on some changes with that training.
Is there an agency that monitors that evaluates training for police?
It's Post. California Post is the statewide. They dictate all of the training curriculum, the minimum hours of every single block of instruction. Now, individual academies, like in Oakland, if they wanted to add another week or 2 or 3 to their academy training for constitutional law, for sociology, psychology, anything like that is on them. But the state of California has a minimum standard, and they dictate everything that goes on in any academy in California.
They rarely, by the way, come into the classroom,
right,
to monitor. They can, and occasionally, rarely have done just that.
So this hour went by super quickly. I have so many more questions, and so does the public. There are 2 things that I do want to talk about, and the big one is, in the meantime, while we are trying to reimagine public safety, what happens in our communities that are plagued with violence? Like, what do we do to address all of the things that are happening in our neighborhoods? If there are not enough police on every single corner to stop things from happening, because I will say, for the record, our police academy, are not just the academies, but our staffing and our department has been fully funded, right? But there's still crime happening. There's still shootings happening. There's still homicides. There's still intimate partner violence. So how do we get our arms around that?
Well, there are long-term responses to that and short-term. And one of the things that Chicago is grappling with is this unprecedented level of violence. It's been building every year for many, many years. Over 100 shootings 2 weekends ago. And that's common, 80, 90, 100 shootings. And people are dying. They're dying on the streets. They're dying in alleyways. They're dying in their homes. It's an extremely, for a big, beautiful city, it's such a tragedy. It's such a, how can you talk about higher level ideals about police behaving in a different way, a different fashion from the way they are today, when people, in fact, are being dropped in their tracks? A lot of it is certainly gang-related, drug-related, and the like. But I think it's got to come from community leadership, from civic leadership, from community activists saying, look, we want police reform. We've put ourselves on the line. We have protested. The George Floyd protests of 2020 are not over. Certainly Portland, Oregon went for a year with intense protest activity. So we've said that. Now, how can we stitch that kind of enthusiasm for reform together with public safety? How is it that we can get the attention, particularly of our young people? And I hate to say this as an XY human being, I'm a male. And the problem of violence in our country is predominantly, certainly not exclusively, but predominantly male. And so got to get the attention of young men as they're being raised, as they are growing up, and as they are going out into the world. I'm just such a firm believer in community organizing, in grassroots mobilizing. It starts with education, with agitation. Oftentimes, it's a catalytic event, a big marker event in the life of a neighborhood. Oh my God, we loved this kid, and he's gone. Did you ever hear his laughter? I mean, what a sweet kid, and he's gone. So we can't just mourn in the moment and then move on. We've got to recognize that the people have the power to create healthier communities. The people have the power to say, it is not okay to hit your spouse, your partner, your intimate other, whether it's under your own roof or in the workplace, or to pull her out of an automobile and shoot her, and your own child. I'm obviously thinking of cases that I'm familiar with. It's unspeakably sad and maddening, because the cops are not going to solve it. The sociologists and psychologists, the community activists are not going to solve it. Elected officials are not going to solve it. Put all those forces together, and you got the makings of a solution. So it does mean transcending those sort of geographical and jurisdictional boundaries and saying, we need to partner. We can spend, it's the walk and chew gum cliche that I'm sick of hearing, but we can talk about public safety and police reform in the same breath. And by God, we better.
Carl, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's shootings are very interesting and obviously the worst case example of what needs to be done. And to what Norm said is true. It's a collaborative effort, but you know, in law enforcement, in the police department, and it's funny, we use the term first responders because that's generally what we do. The street cop is a responder. You have shots fired or you have a shooting, they respond to that call. Now, within the police department, there are generally specialized units, whether it's a gang unit or something else, where they'll work, you know, they'll get intelligence and they'll work on, you know, getting guns. And maybe if you get the gun and somebody who's a potential shooter, but it's like what we started. The premise of this whole discussion is about alternative solutions, reimagining law enforcement. There's a gentleman who's a member of LEAP. He's a former chief in Richmond, California, Chris Magnus. And Chris Magnus, you can read the anecdotes and the stories of how he reduced homicides in Richmond, California by 70% because he came up with creative solutions, creative ideas. And it sounds very idealistic to say, look, let's go into the community. Let's talk to these people, whether they're in a gang or not in a gang, or whether it's a turf dispute or whatever else, and do some positive, proactive outreach, because the end goal is to reduce the shootings. And I think that has as big of an impact is anything that the police can do or the district attorney can do. You know, we have federal firearms laws or shooting laws that, you know, enhance sentencing, but then you're just feeding into the whole incarceration system. And it's finding creative solutions. And like I said, Chris Magnus is a guy that he's now been selected by Joe Biden to lead Border Patrol. And he's a real creative, forward-thinking visionary, and that's what we need. Is we need creative solutions. We need community outreach. We really do, and it sounds oversimplified, but we need community outreach. We need to connect with those people, and that's why I loved walking a beat, because I got to know who was who and what was up, and even the guys and gals to a lesser degree, like Norm said, but the guys who were up to no good, they would still confide in me, and we still had a very cordial relationship, and that's how relationships are built, and ultimately that's how crimes are reduced or stopped altogether.
I just add one thing to the Chris Magnus story. He took a knee in Richmond. He held a Black Lives Matter sign and stood next to protesters in Richmond. He did things symbolically that actually represented a very powerful form of leadership. He was saying to the community, I believe, as a white guy who happens to be a cop, who happens to be a police chief, that Black lives matter, that the lives of our children matter. So he took a very strong symbolic leadership position that comported completely with what's in that man's heart. And it was terrific. He did the same thing in Tucson. And as Carl points out, he's now going to be rewarded by being taken away from city policing. But obviously, Border Patrol is a very important job. And many of us are very happy for Chris.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to point out, he was certainly talking about social justice and racial equity and trying to find ways to achieve public safety at the same time. And it's, I don't think you could do one without the other, personally. And I'm just really glad that, Chris did something that, and he's not the only one. There in the Bay Area in Santa Cruz, the police chief there, Andy Mills, who used to be a San Diego cop, also took a knee. And you see these photographs from a tiny handful of police chiefs doing a highly symbolic thing that they know is going to get the locker room a buzz. It's like, whose side are you on? Well, they're on the side of human beings.
To me, Norm, I just got to ask, because we see those symbolic gestures all of the time. We see symbolic gestures that may have repercussions for officers in the locker room. But we also know that real reform or real change, especially in Oakland, where you have officers engaged in trying to hold other officers accountable, can result in you not getting backed up on calls that are high risk calls. I've heard this from some officers, particularly African American officers, that if they try to blow the whistle or if they call out bad behavior, then they might not get backed up when they need support for a shooting. And so while I think it's great for symbols, the substance is what's needed. And
well,
so I that's just my commentary.
No, of course, substance is needed. There's no substitute for substance, for policies, for procedures, for termination decisions and the like in the day-to-day scheme of things. But I'll confess this, I was reduced to tears by a letter that I got from one of my former officers when I was a sergeant in 1969 in San Diego, African-American officer. He had been called a racial slur by one of his fellow officers. I got in my car when I learned of it, drove immediately downtown and hammered out a report that was just full of emotion. Oscar is not on this earth to be anybody's punching bag. It's a god-awful shame that one of his fellow officers would stoop to this level of opposition to a peer, so on and so forth. So anyway, Oscar said, I never forgot. He died about 3 months ago. But I got this letter a month or two before he passed away. And it just meant so much to me. And I can say, well, that's symbolic. No, the officer who used that language was punished under a regime, I can tell you this with complete confidence, was more in line with the officer who did the name calling than they were Oscar. But because a sergeant, this sounds very immodest, and I apologize for that, but it's important that leaders take a stand, because you don't know what some visible, perhaps symbolic, purely symbolic gesture is gonna what effect that's gonna have. And I'm just convinced that every time we turn our back on an injustice, every time we let it go, whether we're in the police association or in the chief's office, we've blown an opportunity to make a substantive difference and to attract others to the fight, to the struggle. And that's how I think, people get invited into the struggle. My attitude, and I shared this with a number of cops when I was number 2 guy in San Diego and the police chief in Seattle, is if you choose not to back me because I've taken a stand in support of racial justice or professional police work or whatever, take your best shot. And if you have violated policy in so doing, I'll have your badge. There's got to be the sort of the iron fist and the velvet glove. We try to be honorable. We try to present ourselves as ethical human beings. But if when we're tested, we take the easy way out, and we don't, for example, embrace that highly symbolic police chief in full uniform, 4 stars on his collar, taking a knee, getting that photograph in the paper. Of course it's symbolic, but my God, it has a ripple effect. And so I'm saying we do both. We do our homework, we work the policies, the procedures, the substance, and we don't ignore the highly symbolic power, of taking a knee. That's how I feel about that.
I hear you. And I guess one of the things that I'm concerned about for Carl, now that I found out that he's running for office, is that his chances might be shot just for having this conversation with me today. And does that concern you at all, Carl, that you're running for office and you are pushing for a change in how business has been done?
No, that's the short answer. And the long answer is, obviously, it's very clear from this presentation, I can speak my mind and I speak a lot. I've always been very opinionated, even when I was in it for 32 years. It's a job, I will say right up front, I absolutely loved being a cop. I took pride in putting that uniform on every day, putting on the uniform on every day. But I saw some injustices, and although I may not have spoken out because I was indoctrinated, like Norm alluded to at the very beginning, you get indoctrinated into this fraternity and you learn the fraternal ways, and you sort of learn to look the other way. You know where, I prefer the term bad actors. You know where the not good cops are, and you just avoid them if you can. And most cops are pretty adept at that. But over the course of my career, up until this very moment, I've always been very outspoken, and I've been vilified. I'm actually sort of an outcast with a lot of the members of my department and my association. But there's that term, it's a modern phrase. I don't feel really, it's speaking truth to power. And it's just calling it like it is. And I've been criticized openly and behind the scenes. I finally got off of social media because of conflict. And what I realized, it's people are not upset with what I'm saying. They're upset that I'm saying anything. And if that's how I go down in history, or if that's my legacy, I can't. I'm coming out of retirement to do this because, like I said, I've gotten so frustrated up here. I don't expect the backing of law enforcement. What I do expect is the community to sign on to, we need change. We need change really bad up here. And it staggers me to think that in Northern California, in this day and age, we're still dealing with some very draconian procedures and policies. So that's your long answer. No, it doesn't concern me. And I told somebody recently, I know that when I get out on the campaign trail and I start getting more well-known up in this community, because I'm very well-known in San Francisco, I wouldn't be surprised if my car got vandalized or if something, my signs get taken down. But that's the price I'm going to pay. And I also know that I'm coming from a position of power as a white man, as somebody who was a cop. But for every detractor, for every critic, even like I said, in my own agency, there are people that are very critical of me. There are probably 10 more people that love me. And that's what fuels me, and that's what keeps me going. That's why, councilman, councilwoman, that's why you're doing what you're doing, because you're doing it not for your ego, not for yourself. I know that by just this interaction and what I've learned about you. It's for the greater good. And it's just, like I used the term earlier, it's baby steps. So no, I'm not afraid of anybody coming after me.
Oh shit. And Carl, I'm going to ask because I've seen it about 3 times in the chat. Can you explain the blue flu? Because that has been a rumor about some of the things that are happening in Oakland and why violence is not being addressed in a certain way. Can you just explain that for our viewers today? What do you mean? What is the blue flu?
So the blue flu is basically when so in California, I don't know if it's nationwide. California police officers are not, they can't go on strike no matter what's that?
Nowhere in the country.
Nowhere in the country. So because they can't go on strike, when they're to use my wife's term, when they're butthurt about their working conditions or something that adversely affects them, or they feel that this war on police is ramping up, they'll slow down. They won't respond to calls for service, or they'll call in sick. That's where the term blue flu came from. You'll get a lot of, and they've had situations in certain jurisdictions where the entire watch, the people assigned to work that day, won't come to work, and it creates a little bit of a problem. But it also just amplifies how juvenile and how petty some of the behavior can be. And unfortunately, like I said, in New York, I've been following some cases where it's been pretty bad, and they're not responding to serious violent crimes, and that's unfortunate. But that's in a nutshell. That's what the blue flu is. It's just basically a work slowdown or a work stoppage, but it's not an official one because they can't strike.
I see. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Norm, did you have anything to share?
Just my undying respect and appreciation for Carl.
Well, let's go ahead and give all of the love because we're going to go ahead and wrap up. But before we do, I just wanted to say something because Norm, you mentioned Chicago, and Chicago is always in the news, always in the media about things that are happening. And I don't think we can talk about Chicago, sometimes referred to as Chirac, without talking about the government engagement with the projects, that was a huge place where housing was actually tested to see what high-rise, closed quarter living conditions with people in poverty would result in. There were a series of studies that were done by engineers and scientists on putting rats together in close quarters over a period of time and restricting food from them, and a whole series of tests that were done. And the behavior that resulted in the rats, with them eating each other, engaging in deviant sexual behavior, there was all of these things that happened with the rats that has been duplicated or played out with human beings from the Chicago housing projects and folks that were living together in that situation. And as well as the involvement with El Chapo and the trafficking of guns and drugs. Carl, you talked about working as a beat cop in the 80s during the war on drugs. I say all that to say that I don't think we can disconnect the role of corrupt government agencies in trafficking guns and drugs, as has been evidenced in Chicago and even in the 80s and 90s in Oakland. We can't have one conversation with the other.
Right.
It's above all of our pay grades, I'm sure. The levels to which guns and drugs have been brought into the United States, for which gang wars have been created and exacerbated. So when we say all violence is state violence, when you have poverty, when you have situations where people have no other way out but to engage in the sale of narcotics or engage in an underground economy, and the stress that comes from trying to resist that lifestyle, and then you end up kicking your dog or learning to fight with your words from living in an environment that is consistently stressful, we've got to say that all violence is state violence. Yes. Because it starts at the top. And when we get the state out of our communities in that way, which is the engagement in illegal activity, I believe things can change. But we've got to be able to identify when we had the Iran-Contra scandal, when we found out that the war on drugs was really a war on anti-war protesters in the 60s and Black people for the civil rights era, the backlash about that, then maybe we can have some steps forward. And I think until then, these are just baby steps.
Yep.
So that is part of why I'm just trying to figure out what is my role in this time when everything is so much bigger than all of us. But I also believe I am only still for a split second, and then I remember that I have no other option but to tell the truth and to fight for a better tomorrow today. And with that, I'm going to give it to you all both to have some closing words, because I don't want to leave on a cynical note, because I do believe that if we are working together, our communities, and we're truth tellers, and we do that cliche thing, which is speak truth to power, we can create something different. It's just, we are not doing it uncontested. We are in very contested circumstances, and we've got to remember that. So with that, I'm going to give it to you, Carl, and I'm going to let you close out, Norm, and then I'm going to say bye to everybody that joined us today.
I want to start by thanking you so much for having me here. I cannot express to you enough how much this means to me, and this just reinforces exactly what you just said. Sometimes I get overwhelmed. I think about the global issues that we're dealing with, and there's that bumper sticker from way back in the day. It's think globally and act locally, and that's what we're doing. And that's why we're all here, because we've got to make these changes, whether it's from the bottom or from the top. It has to happen. It's just imperative. And every little tweak that we can make to the system, every one of these problems that, there's a laundry list, starting with the training and going all the way down. It's going to take, to quote Hillary Clinton, it's going to take a village. It's going to take all of us collectively here. Look at this panel right here, and all of our viewers and all the listeners. That's how it's going to happen. So I just want to thank you. And I also want to say that I'm always willing to engage with anybody. Tanya has my email address. I'm accessible through Leap. And the more people that we can get involved, the more we can make some change. And it does, I cannot agree with you enough that it does feel overwhelming, but it also feels very hopeful too. I'm never going to give up. I retired and I can't, my conscience won't let me. And that's why you're doing what you're doing. That's why Norm's doing what he's doing. And again, thank you very much for having me. I feel honored and privileged.
Thank you. Norm?
Amen. I mean that. What he said. The only thing I guess that I would add to it, since cynicism became kind of a theme, is that if we can recognize that the police in America belong to the people and not the other way around, if we can really wrap our heads around that, and police learn it as much as the average citizen learns it, there's no end to what we can accomplish. I will remain optimistic because it's my nature. For me, the alternative is, okay, so let's assume for the moment that I agree that none of this is going to happen. It's too big. It's too, everybody that I try to talk to about these views and these values pushes back and resists or says it'll never happen. I don't like being told that. I get my hackles up when people say, you're exercising a form of moral trespassing to tell me that I can't be enthusiastic and optimistic, that I can't believe in the change that I think was launched a long time ago, but picked up enormous steam in the wake of the Memorial Day 2020 public murder of one human being by another human being. I think that awakened the white middle class unlike anything has been able to do. So another cause for hope.
Another cause for hope. Okay, and with that, I think we're going to have to probably have a part 2. There's a lot we did not get to dig into. I'm going to bid you both adieu. I appreciate you for being here. Lots more questions, lots more conversation to have, but thank you all for coming, and we will talk soon. And Tanya, you can release our guests for this evening, and I'm just going to have some closing words with our audience. Thank you both.
Thank you, ma'am.
I think, Tanya, am I still live? Are you all still? Drop something in the chat and let me know if you're still here with me. I hope so. I'm not sure. It just got super quiet, but that was the beginning. If you all are still here with me, that was just the beginning of a very heavy conversation, a very serious conversation, one that we are just beginning, just embarking on what it looks like to invest in prevention, invest not as much as we actually need, but just to start the conversation of what it looks like to invest in communities that haven't had that type of investment in the past. It is not because we want crime to continue. And when I say crime, I always have to preface it by crime. What we see is just the residual impact of communities being told that they are worthless. When you are constantly shown that in every aspect of your life, what happens is you reflect that back into the world. And what we're seeing right now is a reflection of the hurt, pain, and trauma that so many community members have received, and it's impacting everyone. It's what Tupac called thug life. The hate you give, I'm not going to say the F word, but the hate you give little infants F's everybody. And that's what we're seeing. There are Black people in this country who have been hurt and harmed for generations and have experienced hate. And it's effing with everybody. And it's not just Black folks, but it's the secondary predator that we identify on the news. It is the secondary predator that we see and want to have consequences for. But I guarantee if we address the primary predator that is injecting hate into our communities and our societies, we will see that change. And that is the target that I think we all should be focused on. That primary predator that has never resourced our communities and always hated us. If we address them, then we can clean up our neighborhoods. So let's start to address that before we start saying, okay, how do we continue to feed the carceral state? It is a long-term situation. It is something that we have to buckle up for, because as we've seen, folks will have a reaction to us investing in our communities and might even do something so petty as to have work stoppages so that we demand protection from the police, so that we have no other choice but to scream and beg for them. I want to create a community that people are invested in from birth to the grave, and invested in making sure that people have a fighting chance to have a decent life. And that means investment. And we got to start somewhere. So I don't have all the answers. Part of this conversation in this series is to listen to folks and try to figure out how we get there. But this is just the beginning. And bear with me as I'm trying to figure this out. I can't do it without you all. I can't do it without community. So shoot me an email, district3@oaklandca.gov. Tanya Love is my angel who's always helpful when I'm busy trying to go to 20,000 meetings a day and you can't get in contact with me. Tanya is always available. But this is a conversation that is a big one, and we've got to be all committed to finding out the solutions. Once again, this is a collective effort, and I hope you all are in for it with me and supportive with me, to try to make it make sense and to try to get some real solutions for our communities. But once again, this is a live. I'll be back with a special live next Thursday, but this public safety one is a conversation we're going to have to keep having, right, until we figure it out. And I hope to see you all next Thursday, 6:30, same bat time, same bat channel, for some more important community conversations with our lives. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll be back at you next week. Peace.